Thanks for inviting me, Jonathan, and everybody else, for this discussion. Jonathan actually summed up the whole basis of the discussion, I think, very succinctly. So really what I'm doing is perhaps outlining more detail so that we can draw some lessons and significant points out of the situation currently. As Jonathan said, Trump's tariff tantrums continue, and only this last week we had his last weekend he said he was going to put 50% tariffs on all imports from the European Union by Monday at the latest. And then just before we get to Monday, he announces that he's going to delay that for another month in the expectation that a trade deal will be done with the European Union after Ursula von der Leyen had a telephone call with him, presumably to bow before his knees and say that, yes, we will sign a deal before June the 9th. So what we have here is a continual process of tariffs being introduced, taken away, then reintroduced again, and so on. So what's behind this process of tariff imports that Trump has introduced since he came into office, and where is it going to go? So I'm just going to present you with a few graphs just to help that out, as is my wont. So let me just start at the beginning. As I say, Trump's tariff tantrums. And where are we at this position on the level of tariffs? Just to clarify, for those who are not quite sure, tariffs are basically a tax applied to anything coming through on international trade. So governments and customs authorities can add to any particular value of a product coming or a service coming into a country a certain level of tax as a percentage of the value of that product. And that allows then that means that they can collect that customs tax as revenue as process of in accordance with the international trade that's going on. Now, tariffs have not always been popular. And if you can look at this graph here I present before, you can see that since the Second World War, internationally, tariffs have been effectively reduced over a period of time on all imports between the major economies over the last 60 or 70 years. And when we just got to the period of 2020, you can see that tariffs were down well below, well below 5%, around about 2 or 3%, and the effective average tariff on imports.
Michael, we're not actually getting the screen. Sure.
Oh, right. I must have not shared it. Sorry, I'll do it again. Let me just stop that. Yeah, it's my fault. Let's share. That's better, isn't it? You got that?
Yeah, it's visible, yeah.
Okay. So what I was saying was here you've got a tariff which is now round about was before Trump came to office in 2016, his first time round, right down as close as 2 or 3% on average for all the major economies, compared to where it was in the 1930s when there was a major protectionist tariff program conducted all by the major economies, where it was around 20% on average. In the US, two Congressmen, Smoot and Hawley, introduced an act in 1930 to impose tariffs on imports from other countries, and it reached a 20% average. But over the post-war period, it gradually reduced, and that on the argument that what we should be engaged in is free trade, no blockages between trading between countries to supposedly boost the prosperity of all countries, and also to remove all the blockages towards flows of capital as well. However, that policy has now been altered. Trump came into office the first time round and he was pledged to raise tariffs. He saw that as a way in which to improve the position of American industry. And now we've got a program of protectionism and tariffs on steroids in the second period of Trump's office. So we can see the jump that's taken place. We go backwards and forwards with Trump's tariffs, whether they're introduced, reduced, taken away, we've ended up with something around about between 15 and 20% average tariff being imposed by the US on goods coming in to the US, just goods, not services. So that's nearly up to the level, if not to the level we saw in the 1920s and 30s with the Smoot-Hawley Tariffs Act. So nearly 100, reaching the highest it's been in 100 years. Why is Trump introducing this? Well, you could say he's just mad. Some people argue that, but that's not really much of an explanation behind his madness. There is method in this madness, and the method is this. Trump claims that his latest measures are going to liberate American industry by raising the cost of importing foreign goods for American companies and households and therefore reducing the demand for those goods. And the huge trade deficit, which the US runs with the rest of the world, and you can see the latest data here, it's now on a monthly basis averaging about 125, 130 billion a month, the deficit. That's the deficit between what the US exports in goods and what it imports in goods. That deficit, in this case, also includes services, so it's even higher with goods. Now, he says that that deficit is being caused by nasty foreign companies and governments operating unfair trade tactics to stop US exports being sold. And America's been far too easy on the rest of the world and allowed all these goods to come in without any decent controls over them. And as a result, America's lost loads of billions of dollars to go abroad into foreign companies' hands and into governments' hands. And they don't operate free trade for US exports. And so this has got to stop. This stealing, as Trump would call it, has got to stop. So he wants to reduce that deficit and force foreign companies to invest and operate within the US rather than export to it. So he introduced on the 2nd of April, he called it Liberation Day, a whole range of tariffs across the board for every country in the world, and any country that, even countries that didn't run a deficit, the US didn't have a deficit with, were going to have to pay some tariffs. But he introduced through some sort of rather crude method of measurement, what he called reciprocal tariffs, which were going to match the tariffs that these other countries had imposed on US exports. So even the penguins of the southern islands near Arctic, where there are no human inhabitants, had a tariff posed on them accordingly. An indication, by the way, not really about the madness of Trump, but more the fact that this was such a crude and brutal and without any subtlety or any an understanding of the processes of international trade. It was just introduced across the board, and there it is. However, within a short period of time, the reciprocal tariffs suddenly disappeared, and currently the position is that the US has imposed a 10% tariff on all imports of goods into the US, whichever country they come from, with the exception of China, which has a 30% tariff imposed on all its exports into the US, and certain exemptions for countries like Canada and Mexico in certain goods, particularly auto exports, where, of course, it was soon made aware to the Trump administration that imposing tariffs on auto exports into the US from Mexico and Canada was ludicrous, because these exports were coming from American companies who were manufacturing in these countries and returning those exports to the US. So in effect, he was hitting the profits and sales of American companies by opposing those tariffs. That also applied to Apple, which has its major operations in China through its subsidiaries and outsourced companies like Foxconn, which produce the iPhones and so on, which are exported all around the world and also to America. And again, he's had to make some exemptions in this area, because otherwise he's basically hitting really hard key sectors of the US economy. But there we have it. At the moment, we have 10% tariffs across the board, 30% in most sectors of the economy of exports for China, other exemptions, and now a threat to have a 50% tariff on the European Union. Now, some people say this is just a program of threats that Trump just means to shock these countries into doing favorable trade deals with the US so that they can gain greater access to these markets for American companies, and that he's not really going to impose these sort of levels of tariffs across the board. Well, this is called, by the way, I think it's called the TACO situation, where trade is really being reversed, and it's really part of Trump's idea of making deals. Well, that's not turned out really to be the case. There's no sign that the 10% tariff introduced across the board is going to be removed. And it's almost likely, even if there's some deal with the European Union, as there has been with the UK, that a 10% tariff at least will be operating against nearly all exports going into the US. And as Jonathan said, that's a serious situation for American companies operating in Ireland and exporting back into the US, and for Irish companies, if that tariff, a 10% rise, would be a massive rise, as you've seen compared to the past we've seen over the last 40 or 50 years. But will it work? Will this tariff protectionist program of Trump, which he's made so much a fuss about, make America great again? I don't think it will. There are three reasons why. First of all, there's going to be retaliation by other trading nations, and we've already seen that China has imposed, as you like, similar sorts of tariffs on US exports into China. That may not be so important a part of US exports, but on the other hand, US exports aren't that important for either for the US economy or in world trade. So retaliation on US exports only damages US companies without really transforming the picture in any way for the benefit of American companies. Because the point is that US trade and US companies in world markets are increasingly less a decisive force, at least in trading goods, in services, in finance and capital flows, banks and so on. That's a different matter. But when it comes down to manufactured goods, China and other countries have leapt ahead of the US, so that the idea that there's going to be a new market opening up for US exports for companies into the rest of the world is really very, very limited. And also, on the other hand, imports being reduced into the US are either going to increase the cost of goods for people to buy if they're consumer goods in the big stores like Walmart and elsewhere, and also for US companies that need components and other parts which come from the rest of the world, particularly from China, that are integrated into their own activities domestically. So this is going to increase costs. Now, those costs could be absorbed by US companies, retailers, and companies in general, but that means a reduction in profits, or they can be passed on to US households and to the people that the companies are selling to. As a result, that would likely to increase inflation. So because the US can't make a significant difference in world trade by these policies, then it's likely to be just as much a damage to the US economy as it is to the rest of the world. And also other economies like China, like India, like other countries, Brazil, they can start to export to other parts of the world rather than to the US. And we've seen a big diversification already taking place for Chinese exports looking to export to other countries in order to find new sales to replace those that they lose in the US. And also it appears that some companies are trying to set up in other parts of the world where the tariffs might be a bit lower, like in India versus China. Trump has complained that Apple's trying to open plants in India so they can avoid the Chinese import tariff that he wishes to impose. So I don't think in terms of it's going to produce the sort of revenue or change the balance of payments for the American economy in any significant way as a result of these measures. And the crux of the problem here is that the tariff measures, far from restoring the US economy, could actually make the underlying stagnation of the economy, which is increasingly the case, much worse over the next 3 or 4 years if these tariffs are imposed severely and other measures. Because the reason for the Americans' deficit on the balance of trade is not because of unfair practices by foreign governments and foreign companies on the whole. It's minor. If anything, American operations have been far more severe on other countries' exports into the US. The main reason is that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s a move out by American companies, not just American companies, but also European companies, out of their domestic production in manufacturing and other major sectors of the economy, and shifting that abroad to cheaper labor areas, whether it was in Asia, Latin America, even Africa, and so on, looking, and in the case of Europe, into Eastern Europe and so on, looking for cheap labor where they could build new plant from scratch using the latest technology and really boost productivity and profitability for those companies, which they could no longer do successfully in their own domestic environment. So we saw the collapse of the smokestack industries in the US during the 1980s and into the 1990s, and the swing away from manufacturing altogether. So this graph shows you the big decline in the manufacturing share of US employment. So whereas we go back to the beginning of the Second World War, 30% of workers worked in manufacturing in the US. Now that's under 10%, around about 9%. So we've seen 2/3 of those who used to work in manufacturing have left that particular industry. Yes, they've gone into other service industries and so on, but manufacturing employment no longer is a significant factor in the American economy. Manufacturing is still a significant. Manufacturing output is still reasonably significant, but we've seen a dramatic reduction in employment. And one of the things that Trump has said, he says, well, when we get foreign companies to manufacture in the US, then we'll have more jobs. But actually, if American companies or foreign companies start to manufacture in the US, they're not going to increase employment very much. They're going to introduce robots, AI, all kinds of other ways in which they avoid using expensive labor which exists in the US. And that's been clearly the case. So it'll be very limited increase in employment, if there is any increase in employment through this process. And so we have a position where the US is no longer in a position to dictate what is going on in world trade and in world manufacturing, and it's losing its position relatively, economically, globally. If you look at the position in the first world economies, this graph shows the first world economies. So that's basically Europe, the US, Japan, etc. Back in the 1970s, 62% of all the world's output was produced in those first world economies. Now it's dropped to around about 40%, just over 40%. Let's exclude what used to be called the second world, if you like, Russia and its satellites. That's not significant. We can see an improvement in India. India's become more important. It was 3% of the world GDP in 1970s. Now, in the current decade, it's around 8%. And the third world in general, which we now call the global south in the lingo, it's probably not changed its share of global output. It's around about just over 20%. Where has the big change come? We can see back in the 1974, China's output was just 2% of world GDP. And now, in 2022 and beyond, it is over 20%, heading towards 25%. So whereas there was no opposition to the, if you like, the imperialist bloc, the first world bloc, in the rest of the world in terms of its control of the world economy, at least we measured in GDP. Now there is a significant opposition, particularly China. But if we were to add China, India, and the rest of the global south, we see we're talking about matching the level of share of output for the first world. But particularly China, that's the key difference that you can see in those figures. So let me just say briefly the question of whether for workers, it matters whether we have protection. Will protection of your domestic industry mean increased employment, better conditions and wages for workers at home. If they exclude competition from the rest of the world, or is it better to have free trade where everybody trades with everybody and it opens up the world's economies, production increases for everybody, so as the argument goes amongst the mainstream economists, and therefore we all benefit. Well, I think Robert Tressel summed it up in his famous book, The Ragged Trouser Philanthropist, from the point of view of the labour movement, written in 1910, at the height of actually protectionism in the UK and the US. We've had free trade for the last 50 years, and today most people are living in a condition of more or less abject poverty, people starving. When we had protection, things were worse. Other countries have protection, yet many of their people are glad to come here and work for starvation wages. The only difference between free trade and protection is that under certain circumstances, one might be a little worse than the other. But as for remedies for poverty, neither of them are any use whatsoever, for the simple reason that they do not deal with the real causes of poverty. And that's the point, that what we have here, Trump says he's going to make America great again, but he's not going to be able to do that through tariffs, because what is the underlying structure of the American economy? What is going on? What are the contradictions in that, which make it impossible for the American economy at the moment to grow to more than 2% a year in real GDP, and even less per person? And what is there to do? How are protection and tariffs going to alter the rising inequality of incomes and wealth which exist in America and other countries, and the continual levels of poverty and depressed wages for large sections of the population, even in the United States, the supposed greatest, richest country in the world? So I think we have to ask ourselves, is Trump really imagining that protectionism and tariffs is going to improve the conditions of working people? Well, anybody who's seen his latest budget will see that he's not interested in improving the conditions of working people. On the contrary, what he's interested in is re-establishing the political, economic, and financial hegemony and ensuring it for the US imperialism with its junior partners against any opposition around the world to that imperialist bloc and US leadership. And that opposition is obviously mainly coming from China, from Russia to some extent, from some of the so-called BRICS countries, but mainly from China. Not by a belligerent move by China, but by the attempt by the inevitable result of China's economic and political phenomenal growth, which threatens now the position of the US in the world economy. We've seen that China now takes the lead in manufacturing, unlike the US. This is not going to be reversed by protection. That ship has sailed. China is now going to be the dominant, and is the dominant manufacturing power in the world. It now manufactures just over 35% of world gross output. That's the red line. This is China here. You can see the US is the orange line, which used to be much in the lead, even at the beginning of this century, but its share has fallen while China's has phenomenally risen. So that we look on the other side, second graph, we can see the top 10 countries in the world, excluding China, have a share of manufacturing output similar to China. So China has caught up with the top 10 combined. That's an indication of the manufacturing strength that China exhibits, and therefore threatens the very position of American economy in the future, because everything depends on the productive sectors of the economy, not on finance, not on capital flows, and eventually not even on military power, if you have to fall back on that, because without the productive sectors being dominant, then there's a general weakness in the economy. But what we're seeing now is this fear that China is going to become dominant economically has got to be stopped. So we've had bans on Chinese companies, bans on Chinese exports, bans on technology coming from China to try and squeeze it out of world markets, and now threats to try and stop it from growing at all, even in its own region, and fundamentally also a move towards military suppression of China by surrounding it with bases, hostile countries, missiles, etc., in order to weaken its ability to have any influence globally and eventually try to force a change in its regime and its policies in the direction of imperialism. So the major capitalist economies, the imperialist economies, are moving away, and have been for many years, from providing a welfare state, but now they're moving not from welfare, not just getting rid of welfare state, but moving towards a warfare state. That's what's required. So we have European leaders pledged to increase military expenditure to 5% of GDP. I just saw that the only country now in the European Union that has not pledged to 5% of GDP at some point is Spain. It's holding out. Every other country is pledged to raise to 5% of GDP and will probably reach at least 2.5% or 3% of GDP within the next 2 or 3 years. So it's going to be a massive shift of government spending into arms production for the arms companies, most of which are American, by the way, and away from any other civil and public spending, so that welfare and public services will continue to be repressed in the interests of meeting these military targets. Why? Because the Europeans say that they are under threat from a Russian invasion, a ludicrous suggestion, but more importantly, they're under threat from Russia actually resisting them, their ability to expand to the east any further and weaken the Russian state. The Russian capitalist state is an autocratic state led by a bunch of autocratic thugs, if you like, but it's a group, an elite, which is dependent upon itself to survive, and it wants to resist becoming under the control of European capitalist powers and the Americans and NATO. It wants to resist that for its own nationalist reasons, and that's why we have this conflict in Ukraine. And this policy of moving from welfare to warfare is now going to be accelerated over the next few years. And it's not, we can see that here, that Europe is now planning a huge defensive line. It says it's defend itself from Putin's World War III invasion, says this particular graph. But the implication of this really is to surround Russia with the necessary missiles, bases, and so on. Notice that apparently Russia's only got the tanks on the border of Estonia, unlike the fact that the missiles are all the way around here in these countries and, of course, into Ukraine, which for Russia was the last straw. So the European governments, they are preparing for war in Europe. That's the line they're putting to the people, the citizens, and that's what they're attempting to do in terms of their military spending. This is a very dangerous development, which we will see how it unfolds over the next few years, but that's the situation we're moving towards. And of course, over in Asia, as I said before, it's going to be the Americans with allies like Australia, New Zealand, and so on, which they wish to bring into this alliance that they're trying to form with Korea, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, with American military might to surround and suppress the ability of China to exercise not only its economic development, but also its political influence in the region. And of course, the hot point is Taiwan, where Taiwan has been turned into basically a technology island for sending high-level technology exports to the US and originally to China itself, and has now been seen as a satellite, a hot point for which the Americans wish to preserve, even though it originally is and always has been regarded as part of mainland China. So we have growing tensions across the board, going from the tariffs that we saw at the beginning through to the failure of Americans to turn things around with China and other countries in the world economy, towards looking for other solutions, whether it's protection, tariffs. The war will go on towards position of economic bans, financial bans, bans on technology, and possibly even military activity in order to preserve that position. I'll finish on this point, Jonathan, that Beneath this lies the danger of a crisis in the world economy, particularly in the major economies. In my view, there's every likelihood of a slump before the end of this decade. Already, stock markets are way out of line with the profits that companies are earning, and there's every possibility that could lead to some sort of financial crash over the next year or more. Corporate profits, which is key to investment and growth in the major capitalist economies, is slowing. It's quite low. We'll get even lower this year, particularly after Trump's measures. Global debt, that's the amount that companies owe to the banks and financial institutions, and what governments owe to those institutions as well, is at record levels, and that those debt levels are rising, particularly in the US. And in particular, poor countries are facing huge amounts of debt that they supposedly have to repay in the near future. And it seems with Trump's tariffs that we could see rises again in inflation, and interest rates could therefore turn back up, squeezing profits further and making it even more difficult for living standards to be sustained for the major sectors of the economy in the West. So there's a real danger that behind this new program of warfare and attacks upon countries and companies that do not accept the imperialist objectives of the US and its allies, that within that we could see a major slump, which would actually accelerate the real dangers for a geopolitical conflict over the next period. So it's not a very optimistic situation we can paint at the moment. I mean, I haven't discussed what we could do about it, and no doubt we could discuss that as well. But I've laid out, I think, if I best I can, to this evening to everybody about how the situation is developing, how this new development of a tariff war is really part of a general struggle now by the American elite to sustain its position on the world economy and in the world political power structure against resistant powers, but in particular against China. Thanks, Sean.